Can't explain. I've tried, but I'm tongue-tied. Inside of me, a part of me tried to hide. Can't explain. I've tried, but I'm tongue-tied. Inside of me, a part of me tried to hide from the mighty figure that is Ali. For before him, I am meaningless, worthless, knowing that nothing is worth less than a man who feels he is too great for the love of Ali. Like a man whose hatred for Ali outweighs his mental capacity. Like a man who fears love and his connection to divinity. For there's nothing like a man who was the first to heed Ahmed's revelation and accept divinity. A man who from his cradle never prostrated to an idol, unsurprising when his cradle was a symbol of God's unity. A man whose sword struck through Amr ibn al-Amri, who lifted the gate of Khaybar because only Allah was greater, who stood on Muhammad's shoulders as he destroyed idolatry, whose scale of justice was such that he would not sleep full when others were hungry, such that he would carry his sword by his side to seek to murder poverty. A man whose love has made kings of an oppressed minority and still allows it to spill into the ummah in its entirety. It surprises me, not that his birth split the Kaaba, rather Ali split my heart in two. Stepped inside, built a shrine, golden dome that became like home, a sanctuary for lovers and sinners, beggars and preachers, losers and keepers, winners and weepers. It'll make prophets out of disbelievers, make the broken-hearted who fear love more than hell itself become love itself, in love with the Prince of Believers. Ali, Ali, the beacon of truth and the walking Quran. He is the book in flesh in the Bible, Torah and Psalms. Let his name sit on the tongues of those who seek prosperity, because a lifetime can be lived in the call of Ya Ali. His name is not confined to the walls of Najaf. I hear it on the tongues of all. Whenever justice is sought out, for the name of Ali they call. When a soul weeps for stolen land, I hear that soul cry out for Ali. When skin becomes a burden, I hear that skin cries out for Ali. When cages are force-fed children, I hear the children call out Ali. When the sea cannot carry souls to refuge, I hear the sea call out Ali. In the prisons I hear Ali, in the ghettos I hear Ali. Where there is poverty I hear Ali, where there is destruction I hear Ali. In fearful hearts I hear Ali, in broken hearts I hear Ali. Where there is death I hear Ali, and where there is hope I hear Ali. For Ali is a symbol to all of God's infinite justice and never-ending mercy. And know this, wherever there is Ali, rest assured that there will be nothing but victory.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome to this very special event featuring a groundbreaking publication on the life and times of Imam Ali alayhi salam. All the more so that this event is being held in the blessed month of Rajab, the month of the birth of Imam Ali alayhi salam. The event reminds me of these words of Imam Ali when he said that use your intellect to understand something when you hear about it. That is the intellect that examines, and not just the intellect that repeats what it hears, for surely there are many who repeat the knowledge that they hear, and there are few who examining. Really, this is the ethos of the event and indeed the book that we are here to discuss today. The formal title of the book is The Prophet's Heir, the life of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And we have the distinct pleasure today of welcoming the author, Professor Hassan Abbas, and our two esteemed panelists, Dr. Vernon Schubel and Dr. Christopher Clohessy, to this online book launch. Before I introduce our esteemed guests to allow me a few comments to appreciate this splendid piece of scholarship. There is no dearth of books on the life and times of Ali ibn Abi Talib, nor a shortage of accounts in the annals of Islamic history about his character, spirituality, his persona, like the parable of the blind man and an elephant, where a group of blind men, having never come across an elephant, try to conceptualize it by touching and describing each part as the elephant. Many authors have illustrated the multifaceted personality of Ali through their own lenses and painted a multitude of vignettes. But then it's never an easy task to encapsulate the multidimensional persona of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. In fact, an Urdu couplet says, Zate Haidar ko koi kya jane, Zate Haidar ko koi kya jane, Ya Khuda jane, Ya Nabi jane. Translated, that who truly can discern the persona of Ali, but for Allah and the Prophet. That is the stature of the man that we have just heard in the video. And the book today adds to our knowledge of this great personality. Having had the privilege of an advanced copy, I must say that Prophet Abbas has masterfully, in just about 300 pages, contributed to building a rich tapestry of the visage of Imam Ali's life, redressing some gaps and disparities with a fluidity of prose that engages a scholar as much as it captivates a lay reader. He has also skillfully navigated historical reports from the early sources based on Sunni and Shia partisan interpretations, and he brings a refreshing balance by focusing on the commonalities, albeit without sacrificing the clarity on the challenging issues at the altar of diplomacy. That truly is a skill to be admired. Like the proverbial man with the sight among the seven blind men trying to describe an elephant, Hassan Abbas encapsulates the many dimensions of Ali's multifaceted personality and the extensive sources from Sunni, Shia, Sufi, traditional, contemporary scholars from east to the west is a testimony of the author's endeavor to present a balanced publication that serves to do some justice to the one whose sense of justice was indeed legendary. More about the book later. Now, a little bit about the author. I say little because time constraints otherwise. There is a lot that I can say and share about my dear friend Hassan Abbas. But he is not unknown to us as a community. His participation and active engagement, advice on policy, and advocacy matters at many community forums, including Ummah, one of the sponsors of this event, has been a blessing for us for decades. His readiness to serve with humility is a mark of a distinguished scholar, and we are proud to call him one of our own. He is a distinguished professor of international relations at the Near East South Asia Strategic Studies Center, National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He also serves as a senior advisor at the Project on Shiism and Global Affairs at the Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and a senior fellow at the Center of Global Policy, a think tank focusing on the intersection of US foreign policy and Muslim geopolitics. His current research work focuses on building narratives for countering political and religious extremism and law enforcement in developing countries. Earlier, he served as professor and the department chair at the National Defense University's College of International Security and as a distinguished Qaid-e-Azam professor at the Columbia University. He has held various fellowships, including one at Howard Law School's Islamic Legal Studies program, the program on negotiation, the Belfast Center for Science and International Affairs at the Howard Kennedy School of Government, the Asia Society in New York as a Bernard Shaw Fellow, and as a Carnegie Fellow at the New America Foundation. He holds a PhD and an MLD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, and LLM in International Law from the Nottingham University in the UK, and as a Britannia Chevening Scholar and an MA in Political Science from the Punjab University in Pakistan. Dr. Abbas has appeared on various television news shows, including CNN, Fox News, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, News Hour with Jem Lehrer, and so on and so forth. I could go on almost for half a day enumerating his accomplishments, but his books include Pakistan's New Nuclear Bomb, A Story of Defiance, Defiance, and Deviance by the Oxford University Press, The Taliban Revival by the Yale University Press, and Pakistan's Drift into Extremism. He has edited and authored various reports and monographs, including The Myth and the Reality of Iraq's Hashd-e-Shaabi, the Popular Mobilizing Forces, and A Way Forward. ISIS Eyes of Influence in Pakistan, Focus, Fears, and Future Prospects at the Jinnah Institute in Pakistan. So, Professor Abbas, as we invite you to this August forum, two questions. Professor Abbas, why the book? And secondly, tell us about your journey in writing this book. And before I give you the floor, I would just like to read a paragraph that I would love for you to elucidate and elaborate on. You write that it was an ending soaked in tragedy, describing the martyrdom of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. It was an ending soaked in tragedy, and even when Ibn Muljim was killed, justice would not be served and peace would not be found. This would eventually become one of the rare moments in history where action of one would create a spiral in history, a wound that would never find a bandage. We look forward to hearing from you, Dr. Hassan Abbas.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hasnan Walji. I'm extremely thankful to the organizers, especially Mustafa Abidi, to you, Hasnan Walji, and also to two very distinguished scholars, Professor Vernon Schubel and Professor Christopher Cloyce. I'm not saying it just because all of you are here, but your support and the inspiration that I got from your work has played a very important role. I very clearly remember Professor Vernon Schubel's lecture on Ali ibn Abi Talib, I think about 13 years ago at Ummah conference in DC, which has mesmerized the audience. And I still feel the spiritual significance of the impact of that lecture on me. So I'm truly honored and humbled. Dr. Walji, I'm extremely thankful to you for this very kind introduction. And this also reminds me to upfront acknowledge a fact that I'm extremely grateful to God, and I'm extremely thankful to the tremendous opportunities I got in this country, United States, my adopted homeland, which offered me educational opportunities, teaching opportunities, one of the best institutions across US. And I thought the little I owe back is to benefit from the freedom of speech, and the freedom of research, I may add, because that's a very important component, and write something about which there's not enough available in English language as it should be. So leading this to the why question also is that so much is written on Imam Ali, in Arabic, in Persian, in Urdu, in other literature. Um, you go to any part of the Muslim world, and where there's any reference to bravery, Ali ibn Abi Talib's name will come up. Wherever there's a reference to knowledge and scholarship, Ali's name would come up. Whenever you'll go to any Sufi shrine, or you pick any book, and I am saying with a lot of confidence, almost any book on mystical dimensions of Islam, and you'll find Ali to be referred again and again. You listen to the lectures, or the poetry of those who are who operate in this world of esoteric dimensions, and you'll find Ali referred again and again. Pick up the book on the governance systems in Islam. Many other people have done amazing work, but someone who left a deep imprint on what it means to be a governor, what it means be to establishing justice, what it means to establish an equitable and just society. The comments and remarks of Ali, you'll find those on highlighted, if not on the cover, on the very first page. And then the dilemma that he again is the personality around whom the division, the contradictions of Islam are also projected. He was never the source of any division. If he was the source of anything, it was unity. It was bringing people together. It was his struggle, giving up his own right. There was his statements and his speeches very early on, where he said, "Look, I am interested in justice. Keep us," and he specifically said, "Keep aside my case. If any injustice has been done to me, I'm ready to keep that aside. But I will not allow anyone to be unjust to others in society, or to deviate from the path of religion." So that was the inspiration, that we need to step back a little bit from the narratives which are only confined to the Sufi scholars write in a certain way, the Shia scholars and writers portray Ali in a certain way, and among the Sunnis, with so many different groups portray in a certain way, and then there's the extremists. You'll be amazed at the response one gets. Recently, 2 or 3 events, I received this one statement, which I really wish I shouldn't have mentioned here, but just to explain to the audience that when we mention all these traits and important contributions of Ali, some of the statements that come to you, there's one person who said repeated messages through different forums saying, well, we also see a reference that on one occasion, Ali was leading the prayer and he was intoxicated, and that he forgot how many prayers are in a prayer. And I mentioned to them that this is exactly a classic example of the propaganda. Think of this, with all of Ali's legacy, there were people who established their ministries and their offices just to malign the name of Ali. So this was answering the why question. Why and what Ali said that was so distasteful to some that they would distort the message of Islam and would directly target him. There are so many other personalities. Why was Ali targeted? And so in an effort to answer that question, I made this, and I just mentioned briefly 3 or 4 questions which were in my mind. I'm not still very sure I was able to answer, but at least my purpose was to start a conversation around these. And I'm also mentioning these questions because I have 2 very enlightened and accomplished scholars, and they'll also, I'm sure, and you, Dr. Walji, also will help me and understand these things. And hopefully the purpose of the book is to start a conversation. And those 5 questions are, first, which I've already mentioned, despite his extraordinary credentials, why his name is seen in a controversial light by some, especially we know who, extremists. Secondly, those who are still not clear on this, they should think about why Ali, who was so central in Islamic discourse and so close to the Prophet, why his grave had to be kept a secret for 125 years. No one else comparable to him went through that stage, except his wife, Bibi Fatima, which also is very instructive. Then, thinking about faith and history, and that's a point where historians can help us, and 2 of our accomplished, very enlightened scholars. How much of what we discuss and influence us is the fundamentals of faith, and how much is our understanding and inspiration from personalities? Is faith so much dependent on personalities that we can distort the character of a person and that will impact religion? Well, what's the relationship? Is there a correlationship? Is it important? How important it is? And last but not the least, it's so important to see why Ali, even when he thought his right to caliphate was taken away, he never made a fuss about it, in a sense that he never took up arms. And this leads to the other question, how much this spiritual elevation or spiritual status or spiritual position or spiritual responsibility is linked to political responsibility. Do these have to be together or not? That's an important question as well. About the journey, and I'll take hardly 2 or 3 more minutes. About the journey, it was a fascinating experience. It took me to Iraq, to Saudi Arabia, to Turkey, and to many other countries, dozens of times, I should say. I think on every 3 months I was somewhere, and that led to conversations. And I realized that the oral history, what we call, is not fully reflected in our written history. And many things, and I'll just mention one, and if you allow me, I'll recite one and read one, which I found in a book by a scholar, Fazl Haq, who was actually, interestingly, from a very renowned Sunni family, who became Inspector General of Police in Pakistan, who became a poet. And there's a short story. He said he had promised himself that he would write a biography of the Prophet, peace be upon him, but he will write it in a poetic fashion. He will write it through poetry. And he says that when I promised that, my capacity to convert my knowledge into poetry or my skill, it seemed got frozen for some time. And then he went to Medina and other places as well, and he kept on praying that I am such a poet. How come this capacity has been stopped? And he got the message, a spiritual message. I'll not go into details. He got a spiritual message saying, start with Ali, write a biography of Ali first, and then things will open up and you'll be able to write about the Prophet. And he, in his book called Masnavi-e-Maula Ali in Urdu, it's out of print, unfortunately. I was able to find a copy from his son, who is a dear friend, Fazl. I hope many from Pakistan are watching. He might be watching. And I translated this, and I looked this incident, which I'm about to mention, in so many books. I couldn't find it in any mainstream Shia's book, in any mainstream Sunni book. I finally interviewed 2 Sufi masters from a very important silsila. And I said, this is what I have read in a book. Have you figured it out anywhere? And they said, of course, we mention it so often. And I said, why is it not written in books anywhere? And I'll recite this, but the purpose of mentioning this also is that a lot of materials and many of the important things are not available in written form. So the journey took me to those hidden aspects as well. This was when the Prophet, I'll just read, the background is the Prophet, peace be upon him, went for Miraj. Quran narrates that in Surah Al-Isra and Surah Al-Najm. He came back, and that's what I'm reading from. Standing before them under the desert sky, the Prophet reveals to his friends, on the night of Miraj, I have received the Kharkai Fakr, roughly translated as cloak of transcendent spiritual knowledge from God, and I wish to give it to one of you. However, first I must know, how will you do justice to this gift? So the Prophet is talking to his four companions, any four companions, we don't know their names, except Ali. He said, in other words, the Prophet asked each of them what they would do with the special status bestowed on them if they were chosen. The four men before him answered one by one, each one convinced they were right, they were the right choice. The first one promising to spread justice, the second one promising to proselytize Islam everywhere, the third promising to give a lot of charity. When the time came for Ali's response to be heard, he said simply, in commas, I will conceal people's flaws. And unquote. And the Prophet said, you, Ali, are the one who deserves to have this. This episode is especially cherished by Muslims who are the followers in the Sufi tradition. But the point I'm making, that the journey took me to areas which I was not expecting. I remember when first I read it, I said, we often think about the characteristics of a noble man, of a spiritual person. We think of so many things of honesty, integrity, truthfulness, integrity, leadership qualities. Somehow or the other, I never thought from this angle that the central feature which was liked by the Prophet, and coming back from the divine meeting, and the Prophet says, yes, Ali got it right, that it is to cover others' flaws. And I realized, oh, there is a new world that is open in front of me. I leave it at that. And again, I'm very thankful for this great opportunity. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan Abbas. Before we move on to our next esteemed panelist, there's a question that I would like to pose to you to actually complete the picture. In the introduction to the 5th chapter of the book, you sum up the spirit and the style of the governance of Imam Ali by quoting that I aspire to restore the true symbols of Islam, usher in prosperity and secure peace, that the oppressed have no fear. Perhaps if you could just take a couple of minutes to expound on the way Imam Ali confronted nepotism, removed the perks of the grandees and the enemies that he created because of his sense of equity and justice.
Thank you so much for this question. This exactly is the heart of the matter, which is one big response to the 5 questions that I had posed. The people who were against him because they were against the ideals of justice, fair play, and equity. They were against him because Ali, they knew, is not influenced by tribal affiliations. He's not going to go and give any benefit of doubt to anyone just because they are his blood relation. If there was a perfect example of justice in human shape and form, it was Ali. And that's what he had said in his first statement. It's so interesting that his first statement, or when he addressed the audience for the first time, it happened in very special circumstances, which were also unique. I would argue that no other Muslim leader, whether before him or after him, had the privilege or had the honor that the way people thronged to his door. And they came to his door not only because he was seen as closest to the Prophet. If that was enough, they would have, whatsoever happened, majority of them would have fought to ensure that Ali is the first caliph. That never happened at that time. It was a slow realization among the top Muslim leadership and Muslim community. There were reasons which I'll not go into at this time. I've tackled those in detail of what had happened at Saqifa. But coming to the point that you have asked, it was about justice, and I was really surprised as a political scientist, purely from that neutral lens, when I looked at his major statements and his major policy decisions when he became caliph, that it was always well-being of the ordinary people. The famous case where he found a Christian person who was very old, who was badly treated on the street. He stopped everyone and said, well, he would never mention the faith of a person. Famous from his well-known quote, there are two kinds of people, either your brother in faith or your brother in humanity. He stood by anyone, irrespective of their not only faith, whether Christian or Muslim or Jews, and all were there in the community, but also whether they were on his side or against him. We often mention about Kharajites. Kharajites were his worst enemies. People forget. Many historians would not even mention it up front. He said, I will pray the funeral prayers of Kharajites. These are our brothers who have gone the other way. So his viewing everyone through equality, I mean, that's what the new nobles and the new elite that Muslims had was destined with, in a sense, because the Islamic frontiers were expanded through the times of the first three caliphs, especially second and third caliph. Many new Muslims had come, many new rivalries, elitism had come into play. And Ali was saying, no, whether you had accepted Islam at any point, that has nothing to do with the fundamentals of governance based on equity and justice, and the well-being of the people. So you're so absolutely right that this answers one of my questions. That's what led to animosity in the hearts of many people who wanted a privileged position, who wanted a more, not only privileges and money, but wanted some share of the power. And that was not possible under Ali. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan Abbas. The conversation continues. Allow me now to introduce Dr. Vernon Shubel. He is the professor of religious studies and Asian and Middle Eastern studies at the Kenyon College, where he is also actively involved in Islamic civilization and culture programs. He is the author of the book, Religious Performance in Contemporary Islam, Shi'i Devotional Rituals in South Asia, published by the University of South Carolina in 1993. He has authored numerous articles on Islam. He has also conducted research on Islam in South and Central Asia and Turkey. Dr. Shubel received his PhD in religious studies from the University of Virginia, where he specialized in the Islam, South Asian religions, and theory and method in the study of religion. He teaches courses on Islam in the Religious Studies Department, including his foundation course on the topic, Islam's Diverse Paths, along with seminars on Sufism, Voices of Contemporary Islam, and Islam in North America. In 1989, he was a Fulbright Scholar in Multan, Pakistan, where he conducted research on the centers of Sufi pilgrimage, and in 1996, studied the re-emergence of the Sufi tradition in Uzbekistan. His most current research has focused on the Alawi tradition in Turkey. He has published numerous articles on the Sufi and Shi'i traditions, and he's currently finishing work on a new, he just told me, an introductory textbook on Islam, teaching on humanity and introduction to Islam as a humanistic tradition. Dr. Shubel, we look forward to your remarks about the book. You are not unknown to our community, having presented in many, many Ummah conferences and many other events. As a prolific author yourself, please also give us a sense as to how such titles can be used to enhance the understanding of Islamic studies, particularly in Western academia. So without further ado, it's over to you, Dr. Shubel. We look forward to your submission.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to be speaking to this book. Let me begin. I mean, I have 10 minutes, and there's so many things to say, so I'm going to try to limit them. I think it's important that we have this book now for a number of reasons. And the first is that although, as Professor Abbas says, there are lots of books on Hazrat Ali, Within the American and the European Academy, really not so much. The vision of Islam in the Western Academy has been, as many of my colleagues who are working to change this, has been Sunni Arabo-fiqh kalam centric. It has really, in many ways, marginalized topics such as the one that this book focuses on. And I think that's in part because the West wants to see Islam solely as a discursive tradition, as Professor Talal Asad has tried to define it, and in so doing marginalizes the affective traditions of Islam, the traditions that are rooted in concepts of muhabbat and ishq, and in particularly love and devotion to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and Hazrat Ali alayhi salam. When I first traveled to Pakistan to do my first time ever to go to a Muslim majority country, I knew, I was 30 years old, and I knew I'd find love for Ali in the Shia community. What I did not expect and what I found was the depth of love for Ali outside of that tradition, particularly in the Sufi tradition. And I think we need to be honest here. The Sunni tradition and the Sufi tradition are not separate, either in South Asia or in the rest of the world, as I'll say later. So much of the way in which Islam finds its way into introductory books of world religion wants to de-emphasize the importance of love for the Prophet Muhammad. Every single introductory textbook contains the story where Umar denies that the Prophet has died, and Abu Bakr says, let all those who worship the Prophet know that the Prophet has died, but let all those who worship God know that God lives. And that's a very true statement. But I feel too often that's in there to make it clear that Nubuwwat is not nearly as important in Islam as it really is. As Vincent Cornell once said on a talk on NPR that still sticks in my mind, we can say the Prophet is just a human being if a ruby is just a stone. And in that sense, there is a way in which Muslims have understood the love for the Prophet is really central. When I first started studying Islam, my very first professor, when I said, how can I really understand Islam? He said, you really need to know the life of the Prophet. And it took me years to realize why that was so important. To really understand why understanding the life of the Prophet is so central to Islam. And as I'll say in a few moments about Professor Abbas's book, you cannot understand the life of the Prophet without understanding Ali. Because as his book really demonstrates, their lives are so intertwined, you can't really look at one without looking at the other. And perhaps it's for this reason that, although, again, when you pick up introductory texts, they'll always tell you that Sunni Muslims rank the caliphs in order of excellence in the order in which they served, and Ali is the fourth. It has never been my experience in talking to Muslims in many parts of the world that that's the case. There's something special about Ali in the hearts of Muslims. No one, and this is not meant to be diminishing, has ever said, Ya Abu Bakr Madad. But this people daily throughout the Muslim world call on Madad from Hazrat Ali. And why is that? You know, there's a very famous Sunni hadith that says that the first thing that Allah created was the nur of the Prophet. And Muhammad and Ali were taken from that light. And we can take that literally, but just think about it metaphorically. What that means is, if you want to understand the light of Muhammad, you can look to the life of Ali. And if you want to understand the light of Ali, you have to look to the light of the Prophet. You cannot pull them apart. And perhaps that's why. And again, people all over the world say Ali Madad. When I was in South Asia, I heard that, and people would come back. When I would tell them this in America, they'd say, well, maybe that's South Asia. But when I went to Uzbekistan, Ali is known as Shah-e Mardan. Ali is known so much so that when I talk to Naqshbandis, who are often portrayed as the Sufi order that goes through Abu Bakr and not through Ali, so many of them said, yes, but we have another silsila that goes through Imam Jafar al-Sadiq. So Ali is everywhere. In Turkey, he is Shah of Lian. to the Sunni majority and to the Bektashis and Alevis. And finally, in Sunni Egypt one day, I saw a munshid performing before thousands of people in the open air. And he said, Ya Rasul min Nurullah, Ali Ali min Nurullah. And there are very few Shia in Cairo. And this got a tremendous response from the crowd because Ali has this special relationship with the Muslim community. And I want to just point out, having said that, the three things that I take away from this book. There's so many more, but there's three directly. The first is one that I've already mentioned, that there is no way to separate the life of the Prophet from the life of Ali. And this book does this, I think, more than any other sort of book that I've read on this. You really see how these two lives are so bound together that one, you know, it's difficult, if it's impossible to be a Muslim without loving the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, you know, the second half of the Shahadas is about Muhammad. We shouldn't forget that. And if we should love Muhammad, of course, how can we not but love those whom he loved? And whom did he love more than Ali? But their lives are so intertwined. And I think that that's the first thing that I really took away from this. The book is called The Heir of the Prophet, but the first half is also a biography of Muhammad, and a very, very excellent one at that. The second thing I take away from this is something that I think really is important to recognize. When I went to do my dissertation research in Pakistan, people would pull me aside and tell me, everyone says that the struggle after the death of the Prophet was about the caliphate, but it wasn't. It was about the imamate. The thing that makes the Sunnis and Shias distinct from each other isn't about primarily that which was Ali's right, which was the caliphate, but about his status as the imam. And I think that Professor Abbas's book makes very clear, and it's really important, Ali was never willing to risk the unity of the Ummah for his right, which was Khilafat. And, you know, this got me thinking about Ghadir and what happened there. It's interesting. The Prophet didn't say, you know, Ali will be the Khilafat. Ali will be the Khalifa. He named him as Mawla. And in so doing, he pointed out that no matter what happens, no matter if anybody recognizes it or not, Ali is the spiritual leader of the community. Ali is the guide for the community. That's not something human beings get to decide. And yes, the Khilafat was his right, but it becomes clear, Professor Abbas's book, that that was not something that he was willing to risk the lives and the unity of the Ummah over, and that what was really important was his role as the spiritual guide, and more than just the spiritual guide, and I'll get to this, the guide in terms of providing a model of humanity within the community. And that's the link to the third thing that I take away from this book that, again, I think is really important. We emphasize the importance of Ali in the Shia tradition, where being the Imam has specific meanings. But this book also makes clear how important Ali is as the gate to the city of knowledge. And that's both in terms of didactic and discursive knowledge, because he was the person who had the greatest ilm of the Quran, and he was the person who has the greatest ilm of the Prophet. He spent more time with him than anyone else. He basically grew up in the same household. He lived with him. But I think that we see this for the most part in the Islamic world, in the larger Islamic world, in that he is the person with true mystical knowledge. Even those who do not accept him as the Imam in the Shia sense, the great majority of Sunnis throughout the history of Islam have seen him as Sha'i Aliyah. In fact, I would argue that through Tasawwuf, Ali has provided the bridge that connects the Sunni and Shia communities. And what connects them in many ways is their love for Ali. And I'd go even further. Again, using Sufi terminology, Ali is seen almost universally in the Sunni and the Shia worlds as the perfect example of Insan al-Kamil, in that not only as the greatest Sufi and the greatest mystic, but as the best of humanity, as Shah-e-Mardan, as the king of men. And in that sense, he is the person who most manifests akhlaq. And again, I come back to a hadith that I'm paraphrasing, and if I get it wrong, I apologize. It's always dangerous to get a hadith wrong. That the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "The greatest in my community is the greatest in akhlaq." And clearly, Ali has been seen by poets, by mystics, by ordinary Muslims as the greatest in akhlaq and as a model for all of humanity to follow. And that is really clear on every page of Professor Abbas's book. Those are the main things that I've taken away from it, and I'm very proud to be able to speak to that today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shubal, for those very insightful comments and sharing your experiences and your thoughts with us. We'll come back to you with a few questions, time permitting, in terms of the submission at this point in time. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Christopher Clohessy, who is a South African-born Catholic priest who holds a Bachelor of Sacred Theology from the Pontifical Arbi Neyman, if I butchered that word, forgive me, University in Rome, and a PhD from the Pontifical Institute for Arabic and Islamic Studies, also in Rome. He is at present a resident faculty member of PISAI, where he is a professor of Shia Islamic Studies, as well as lecturing in the Quranic Studies, Islamic Ethics, and Christian-Muslim Dialogue. He's also a visiting lecturer at the Pontifical Beda College in Rome, where he is an active participant in the Christian-Muslim Dialogue. He is also the author of Fatima, Daughter of Muhammad, Half of My Heart, The Narratives of Zainab, Daughter of Ali, and Angels Hastening, The Karbala Dreams, all published by the Georgia's Press. In 2021, Half of My Heart, The Narratives of Zainab, Daughter of Ali, was nominated by the Book Authority in conjunction with CNN and Forbes as one of the 95 most important books on Islamic history. And in February 2021, Dr. Clohessy was awarded the Islamic Republic of Iran's 28th International World Book Award in the category of the Distinguished Researcher. Dr. Clohessy, I read your insightful review of Professor Abbas's book, and that was extremely interesting. And you write that in its final chapter, as if in response to all these allegations and accusations, the author outlines the humanity and the quality of Ali ibn Abi Talib, by which such skepticism and doubts are effortlessly negated. The motives that drove him, the spirituality that suffused his life, and his legacy of justice, seen in his children, especially Al-Hussein, Al-Hassan, and Zainab, and their heirs. In your reflection today, please elaborate on the relationship of Imam Ali alayhi salam, particularly with his daughter Sayyida Zainab, given that you have written the award-winning book, Half of My Heart, The Narratives of the Zainab, Daughter of Ali, and in particular in remembrance of the wafat, the death anniversary of Sayyida Zainab. So with that, we welcome you and we look forward to listening to you, Father Clohessy, please. If you can possibly unmute yourself, Father Clohessy. You're muted, sir.
There we are.
There we go.
I'm not a technocrat, I'm afraid. I was very happy to see on the left-hand side of Dr. Abbas's bookshelf a copy of Mandela's Long Walk to Freedom, and that immediately enthused me, besides your own book, of course. So let me begin by echoing what Professor Werner Schubel has said quite correctly, because I speak as a Western student, really, more than a scholar, but I speak also as a Catholic priest and a historian, and certainly there exist biographies and fragments of biographies about Ali. I have on my own bookshelf Chiri's 2-volume work, and I have Shah Kazemi's masterful work about the virtues of Ali. But the truth is that there is an inexplicable gap in Western scholarship, as Professor Schubel has already underlined, an inexplicable gap. And I think that Professor Abbas has stepped very skillfully and very eloquently. And I don't lavish praise easily, as my downtrodden students will tell you. I think that he has stepped eloquently and skillfully into that inexplicable gap and has produced a book which I think is not only superb for a contemporary readership, but most especially, I think it's a book that is superb for a non-Muslim and a Western readership as a profoundly deep introduction into the life of Ali. We have to admit from the start, and I said this last night, that a number of Western scholars, not only Western scholars and historians, have ill-treated Ali in their writings, and that is partly because they have not objectively read the texts, the primary sources, as they stand. This is partly because some historians can read facts, but not always the motives behind the facts. And so I've read Western historians who have described the Khalifa of Ali as an unmitigated disaster. This is the words that they use to describe Ali desperately trying to save lives, desperately trying to prevent more civil war. So a number of those famous events, obviously what happened at Ghadir Khum, obviously that chain of events like the Saqifa event that took place immediately after the death of the Prophet, but also more importantly, the meaning given to the words spoken by the Prophet, for example, at Ghadir Khum, not the actual words themselves, which are not disputed, but the meaning behind those words, those have not always been read objectively and carefully, I think, by a number of Western scholars, so that Ali, like his first son, Al-Hassan, is quite often portrayed in quite an unflattering light. And I think that Professor Abbas, more than anything, has stepped into this gap and has produced in these very compact, very beautifully illustrated chapters, has produced a corrective of what I think is a very skewed vision of Ali. Now, I have to admit that I have spent so many years listening to the voice of Lady Fatima and the voice of Lady Zainab and the voice of Al-Hussein that my ears have grown deaf to other voices, and I have not myself plunged deeply into the life of Ali. In fact, I too am privileged to have an advanced copy of this book, and I've read it twice in the matter of a few days because I really felt the need to inform myself. And that is why primarily the first thing I say is that for any non-Muslim readership, someone who knows nothing about the history of the Prophet of Islam or Islam itself, this is a superb work, not just an introductory work, something much deeper than that. It is a superb work. And Professor Abbas uses a language of which I can only stand in envy. That description, for example, of Mecca as a place over which hangs what he calls a subtle taste of spirituality. I envy that phrase, and I wish that I'd used it in one of my books, because I think it is a perfect description of the Mecca into which Ali was born, but more especially the Mecca in which he lived out so much of his life. The professor has given a non-Muslim readership a sense of the ambience of that place, of the texture, if you like, of what was happening both in Mecca and also in Medina. And while I agree, I think he gives a very good introduction to Muhammad himself, he never loses sight of his principal subject. His principal subject is, of course, Ali, who is inseparable from childhood, from the Prophet of Islam. I think that Professor Abbas has shown us beyond convincingly of the impact that Abu Talib, Ali, has on Muhammad's life, so that I agree with Professor Shubal. I think that you cannot understand the life of the Prophet of Islam if you do not read and understand the life of Ali, who would have been just a boy when the Prophet began preaching, yet he is, with Lady Khadija, the first to submit, the first to pray, the first among these eager and loyal volunteers. There's that famous Yawm ad-Dar incident in which this young Ali volunteers to be the one who will help the Prophet be his brother, his executor, his successor, when all around him remain silent. So I think that the professor, over these series of chapters, has laid out in a convincing, a readable way, a scholarly way, all of these elements that convince you of Ali's importance, the fact of who he is in the Prophet's life as the closest male, the son-in-law, the cousin, more than a cousin, a brother, that he's willing to give his life for the Prophet, that he's the first to pray with him and believe in him, that he is ready to carry the standard in battle for him and place himself in great danger, that he acts as a regent when the Prophet is absent. All of these things. And then, of course, the crowning glory for me is the divinely ordained marriage to Lady Fatima, which suggests the increasing prominence of Ali in the community. These important historical moments that are easily overlooked when people read the history of Islam, at least the historical evidence of Islam. I am particularly interested, of course, in chapter 5, which is about the Khalifa of Ali, because this is where so many historians refuse to accept anything credible about him, leading up to his own murder in the Kufa mosque, but most especially his attempts to save lives, his attempts to prevent bloodshed. And these motivations are the motivations that the historians do not always read when they read about the way that Ali dealt with the Khalifa that is given to him. These battles, Camel, Safin, Nahrawan, these battles that he engages in, not for the sake of fighting, but in order to preserve Islam, these negotiations that so many people just call compromise, but they're not compromise. Saving lives is never a compromise. And so the skepticism and the doubts with which Ali is read, I think, is corrected by what I say, and I do not say this lightly, is a superb work of biography and history. Of course, the stories of Ali and Zainab, the sources are very few for the early life of Zainab. So we know that Ali heard her praying and was profoundly moved by her prayer, that he heard Lady Zainab reciting maybe some fiqh and some tafsir and was profoundly moved and eventually asked her to become a teacher. But more important for me is that Zainab is described as one who speaks with the tongue of Ali, that she runs after the tongue of Ali, or the tongue of Ali runs after her. So she stands before these two great tyrants of her day, just as once before her father stood before tyrants, and there, speaking as her father would have spoken, speaking as her brother Hussein would have spoken, there Lady Zainab gives the justification for all of that history and how it developed. And so in a moment you have encapsulated in this extraordinary woman, this extraordinary father who has taught her and in whose shadow she has grown up. So I think this is a fine piece of scholarship. And I myself have written my little works, and my works pale in front of these because this is a more important subject, that people in the West know who Ali is. But I myself wrote my works because I was perplexed by the gaps that existed in biography amongst Islamic scholars, that people like Lady Fatima, Lady Zainab, Abbas, all of whom have huge devotion and yet very little written. So this, for me, fills an inexplicable and a crucial gap. And I am not only grateful for the opportunity to say a few words, but I'm even more grateful that I had the chance to read it and I was allowed to make some written comments on a very fine piece of work.
Thank you, Father Clohessy, for elucidating and sharing your words. And thank you also for your service to add uh, Shi thoughts and literature in academia. Your works obviously are of immense importance. At this point in time, allow me to just pose a couple of questions. One question to Dr. Abbas, and then one question to all the panelists, including Dr. Abbas. Uh, Professor Abbas, the penultimate chapter, uh, you cite sermons that give rise to the spiritual movement that came to be known as what you describe as the Sufi tradition. Interestingly, and I'd love to also hear comments by Father Cloyce on this particular point, is you introduce this Catholic symbolism stating that Ali is considered to be the patron saint of the Sufi tradition. And obviously, this is peppered with quotes of Ali's adoration from many Sufi masters like Rumi, Sadi, Hafiz, and all that. So, give me some sense of the use of the word patron saint, which to me is probably one of the first time I came across appellations given to Amirul Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam with many, but patron saint maybe was not one that I had read before. So first, Professor Abbas, and then Father Cloyce.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walji. First, let me say that I'm truly not only honored, but I'm speechless after hearing the feedback and comments from the two very illustrious speakers. I say it with the core of my heart. I think on the day of judgment, I'll be able to take these two statements from these two people as certificates to request for my salvation. I'm very convinced, if they allow me. Also, this is an apt moment for me to just thank a few people, because this statement, a subtle taste of spirituality, I must confess, I owe it to my 20-year-old daughter, Zahra, who's studying at King's College London. She's studying religion and politics. She's studying Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And it was my wife, Binish, who added this story to the book, my daughter, Zahra, who added this flavor. And they continuously said this to me: make some humble contribution to Ali, don't use your boring academic tone, make it lively. And I think they read so many times. And my editor, Heather McCallum at Yale, who stood by me, they were peer reviewers who said things which I cannot repeat. But luckily, always the majority were supportive. But my editor at Yale and my daughter and my wife, this was, as I've mentioned elsewhere, it was a family project. We tested it on our family, debated, discussed. I'm also extremely thankful to Maulana Talmiz Hussain Rizvi, who's based in New Jersey. I'm thinking of Mustafa and the contribution by local scholars. His library was there. I'm not a scholar of Arabic language, so always I could pick up my telephone, call Maulana Talmiz. He would always have books ready for me. Other than so many others in Najaf and Karbala, my travels to Najaf and Ayatollah Sayyid Sayyidul Hakim, so many other scholars who corrected me on every point in so many ways. So I thought this is worth to explain. This is important to explain that this is a work of so many people. I probably am just the vessel or just the final Vasila, but it is so many of the collected wisdom of so many people that was useful. On your question of patron saint, and this can be seen slightly controversially as well, as Professor Christopher has so rightly mentioned. My target audience, if I may call that, was also the Western audience, both Muslim and non-Muslim. And I was looking at many discourses on Rumi, for instance. There has been an effort in Western, not academia, but Western scholarship will also be not the right word, but the popular Western media saying Rumi was a great mystic. He was not necessarily a Muslim. Saying things to the effect that the Sufi and mystical tradition somehow is another parallel tradition. And I was trying to figure out a Western concept or a Christian or Jewish concept which allows me to explain to my audience what is the real meaning when we say the great Sufi master. Probably I could have picked even a better word, but spit saint, although they may not fully explain it, was the phrase I found to be most relevant. My colleagues here and my mentors, both of them here, can explain better. But that was the reason I picked this word. Also, I found I've been part of some WhatsApp groups within the Muslim groups, mostly Shia groups. And if I may dare say, with all the respect, I greatly learned from those. But the huge debates about Ibn Arabi, whether Ibn Arabi was even a Muslim, and it was so distasteful or so challenging, because there are so many who would say Sufi is not the right word, Arif is the right word. But some will say no, Arif is the Shia Sufism. With such a beautiful concept, there have been so many interpretations creating confusion. So I was looking for the best ways. So I've used the word Sufi, I've used the word Arif, and I thought if I have to explain it to my Western audience, whether I've done right or not, my Professor Christopher Cloyce especially will correct me. But that was the understanding, that was the reason. Thank you.
Go ahead, Father, please.
So, in fact, the use of the word saint was the one thing that I didn't stumble over. I congratulate your daughter. I hope she's going to write books one day. She has a beautiful turn of phrase. Even some of the words of Ali himself, describing himself as following Muhammad the way a young camel follows in the footprints of his mother. That is a beautiful turn of phrase. Saint didn't shock me particularly, A, because I've heard it used in Islamic circles before, and I myself have sometimes said, well, I'm not sure if it's a good word, it's got a certain baggage. However, in Catholic spiritual tradition, a saint, among other things, is defined as a person who lives virtue to an heroic degree. Therefore, it is a perfectly good word to use to describe one whose virtue of justice, especially, and virtue of truth, among other things, is lived heroically, even to the shedding of blood. It is a perfect use, I think, of the word.
There we have it. There we have it, an endorsement. Thank you, Father Cloyce. I'd like to invite our esteemed panelists to pose or address any questions, any issues. Dr. Shubha, please. Please unmute yourself. You need to unmute. There we go. Thank you.
Well, as long as we're raising the issues of Sufism here and of Ali speaking outside of the Shia community, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the way in which Ali speaks and unites the minority Shia community with the majority people who identify as Sunnis through that Sufi tradition, but also just through his life, his image, his presence within Islam. I mean, do you think that love of Ali is one of the things that can allow for these communities to see themselves as part of the same ummah?
Professor Abbas, please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, Professor Shubal himself can answer this question far better than me, but I was thinking of, in the Sufi tradition, a statement from Nahj al-Balagha, which opened up this new world to me, especially the way Sufism is seen in the Sunni world. And Professor Shubal is so right. Sufism is also there, Shia Sufis as well, but Sufism by and large has been more linked to the in itself as an independent school of thought, you can say, but not in a jurisprudence way. It has been more linked with the Sunni school of thought. You will ask most of those people associated, they will not be sectarian. That was based on my interviews across the Muslim world. You ask a Sufi and they would not immediately say I'm a Sunni or Shi. They take pride in their own central Islamic identity. But this one statement from Nahj al-Balagha from Imam Ali alayhi salam is very insightful. I'll just read it. The earth will never be empty of one who establishes the proof of God, whether overtly with publicity or fearfully in obscurity, lest God's proofs and elucidations come to naught. But such as these, how many are they and where? By God, they may be the smallest in number, but with God, they are the greatest in rank. Through them, God preserves his proofs and elucidations so that they entrust them to their compeers and sow them in the hearts of those resembling them. Through them, knowledge penetrates the reality of insight. They rejoice in the intimacy with the spirit of certainty. They make easy what the extravagant find harsh. They befriend that by which the ignorant are estranged. With their bodies, they keep company with the world, while their spirits are tied to the transcendent realm. They are the vicegerents of God on his earth, summoners to his religion. That to me is the essence of what we say, whether Sufism, Awliya, or Orafa. I hope I got the question right. That's what is the core of spiritualism to me.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Thank you. Go ahead. You wanted to say something, Dr. Shubha?
No, I just wanted to say I was not familiar with that passage from Nahj al-Balagha, but it does sum that up nicely. If you could send me the link at some point to that, I'd love to be able to share that with my students, because that was very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Father Claus, any question or comment you'd like to address to the author?
Just a point of interest for me, and it's because I am ignorant of this subject, so I'm asking out of real interest, and that is that I'm interested in the relationships between Ali and whatever existed as Christian communities in Kufa, for example. We know that there came a time after the death of the Prophet when Christians communities were somewhat excluded, for example, from Mecca, when they were moved out of Mecca. But in terms of Christian communities in other parts like Kufa, where Ali would eventually die, do we have solid evidence, primary sources that you've come across which describe some of his attitudes to, or even more important, his relationships with the Christian communities? Because we know that there were some polemical debates about keeping Christians on, for example, as experts in the bureaucracy, experts, leaders. I think there's a famous debate with Umar about not having a Christian working as your secretary or servant. So I'm interested in a later interpretation of Ali himself in his. Did you come across these relationships and his general attitude?
Thank you so much. Two references which I found and which were kind of new to me. One is first to the Prophet, as was rightly mentioned. You cannot understand Ali without the Prophet, or vice versa. But there's this famous incident. There's this famous farewell speech by the Prophet, peace be upon him. There's other statements during his last days, Ghadir Khum, of course. But one very interesting sermon or very interesting statement from the Prophet is during his last few minutes or hours. And that is where he mentions Christians. And I think that's what Ali borrowed learned from him or borrowed from him. First is this famous incident that the Prophet said, bring me a pen and paper. I'll not go into that. It's slightly controversial for some, but it's a very well-known fact from mentioned in Sahih Muslim and Sahih Bukhari as well, or one of these two. When the next day, when the Prophet was slightly unhappy, quite unhappy, I should say, and he said to everyone, you're not giving me pen and paper to write what I want to. No one knows what he wanted to write. People have interpretations, and Prophet said, leave me. Everyone left. Next day, according to one major source, I think Tabarasi, some of the people went back to the Prophet and said, Prophet, now we are ready with pen and paper. Would you like to tell us what you want to say? And it's so interesting. I hope I'll find the reference right away. I will find in a minute or so, but I'll paraphrase till then. The Prophet responded by saying, no, the moment for that is gone, but I have some final thoughts and guidance for you. And in that final statement, the Prophet emphasized that take care of of those who are dhimmis. Dhimmis at that moment were either Christians or Jews. Exactly the same moment was repeated when Ali was on his during his last moments, and he talked to Hassan in his final will. There is a longish will which is separate than this in his final moments. Ali almost word by word repeated what the Prophet had said, and I'll repeat. He said, fear God with regard to those who have a right to your protection and hospitality. Fear God with regard to the protection granted by your Prophet, and do not allow the dhimmi, non-Muslim, to be oppressed among you. Now, the dhimmi was only Christians and Jews. So that tells me that there most certainly were even significant number or sizable number of Christian Jews, which was so important for both the Prophet and Ali in his final moments to say, look, if we have to tell you final three things, one of that is to take care of the minorities among you. That tells me that that's as an evidence. And there are some other references in Nahjul Balagha as well, where he specifically referred to a Christian. But this is an area of further research, and I look forward to at some point start digging. I've already many books that I have, which I couldn't even open or touch. I hope I might be able to someday do an expanded volume on this or something like this, or at least get some of the sources out to answer brilliant questions like these. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few more minutes and to close this and allow our esteemed panelists to also have some closing remarks. I'd like to share this reflection and put a question to all of you. Using a quote by Professor Muqtadar Khan, Hassan Abbas drives a point which was very interesting and perhaps one of the ethos of what this book may be able to do. And the quote was that everybody loves Ali. If Ali can help Muslims to come closer to God, and we talked about Irfan, Sufism and all that, that if Ali can help Muslims come closer to God, why can't he also be someone who brings Muslims closer to each other? Indeed, a profound quote. My question addressing all three of you is, how can Muslims come closer to each other? And some reflections and your closing remarks at the same time, so we have a conclusion to this event. I will begin with Father Clohesy, please.
Of course, it is an interesting question, and it's curious that as we stand on the eve of the Pope's visit to Iraq, where he will certainly go to Najaf, I'm not sure if he will actually visit the shrine of Ali. Some people said this, but it doesn't matter, because as Brother Nouri said in that beautiful poem we heard earlier on, the name of Ali, escapes Najaf and escapes from there into the world. But people have asked me, do I think that the Pope's visit there will help to bring Shia and Sunni together? I don't, because I think that it's not his field of expertise. It's not his competency to do that. I think that's a divine competency, God's competency, to bring people together in such a profound way. But I think, and it relates to a question that you asked right at the beginning in terms of personalities, the importance of personalities vis-a-vis faith. I think that personalities are crucial in faith. The great problem today, both in the East and in the West, in academia, is that sometimes the scholars who are writing, they mix up practices and principles. And this was a point was made years ago by a very good scholar, that you don't ever want to do that. What a religion teaches and how people live that religion is not necessarily the same thing. And we don't want Islam judged on the way some bad Muslims live it. Anyone can explain the existence of bad Muslims. It's how to explain the existence of good Muslims. That's where you really have an issue to describe, in the same way as Christianity. And I think that in the same way that you could visualize that, I think that certain personalities play an increasingly important role in people's faith. That's why we have saints. That's why we have people who who visit the shrines of the great saints, if you like, in Sufism or Tasawwuf, the great saints in Shiism, because personalities affect our faith, the way they affect our politics, the way they affect the things we like and dislike in life. I think they are crucially important. And therefore, we have to find the personalities who are able to bridge gaps. Again, as an example, people were saying, well, you know, the Pope is going to meet with Ayatollah al-Sistani, but he's in Najaf, he's not in Qum. Well, in fact, he studied in Qum and in Najaf. So he's a personality who straddles, if you like, both theological traditions. I think that this is what Professor Shubal said earlier, that Ali straddles the two great families of Islam. And this is most highlighted, of course, in the devotees of Tasawwuf, who look to him as a master without necessarily being Shia. I think that he straddles these two great families of Islam and is one of the personalities who is able to bring them together. But there has to be that desire. Unity is not something that happens automatically, just as peace doesn't happen by chance. It takes hard work by intelligent people. And I think that this book is one of those aspects that adds to that. If I as a non-Muslim read this book and I'm enormously attracted by the personality of Ali, how much more a Muslim reading this book is going to be attracted by the personality of Ali? So I think that his personality alone is the thing that could well, through books like this, bring the two members of the family a little closer together. I'm not sure if that answers the question, because it's a profoundly difficult question to answer.
Thank you. Thank you for those, very profound comments. Dr. Shubal, please.
Well, let me come at this a little bit more sideways. It strikes me over the last few years that one of the things I've been learning about Islam is how important what Islam is about in terms of finding our humanity is in controlling our nafs, the part of us that is more animal than human. And when we look at the history that Professor Abbas describes in the book, Muawiyah, Yazid, Marwan, in their search for power, they were feeding their nafs. But even if we don't want to judge them, because we maybe shouldn't judge people, it's clear that Ali was always controlling his nafs. That at one point, I noticed one of the things Professor Abbas said, that in Islam, it's not wrong to be rich. I forget which page that's on. But I would point out that it always struck me that I think if you were to ask anyone in the 15th, 16th, 17th century, what's the main thing that we should, that you think about when you think about the Prophet or Ali, they would probably say he was a fakir. And he was a fakir who stood with the poor. And, Ali, as a person who spent his whole life controlling his nafs, he had a right to the khilafah. I don't want the people who are listening to think that, by emphasizing the Sufi part of Ali, that I'm denying the fact that he was a model for social justice or the person who had the right to be caliph. But he would not feed his nafs and grab hold of my right is there, and because of my right, I'm going to do whatever it takes. He could not be fooled by his nafs, convincing him to do other than what was right in order to take power. And I think if we look at Ali as someone who is this model of how we are in control of our nafs, and again, if we're going to look at the Sunni Shia thing, I think one of the things that I think is very important, Iran may be a Shia country. Rumi has never gone out of print. Rumi still remains beloved, and Rumi is clearly a Sunni Muslim who loves Ali greatly, and whose book is entirely about why we need to control the nafs, and how on page after page, Ali is the master of showing us how we control the nafs and thus become more human and less animal. And in that sense, I think with Ali as Insan al-Kamil, that this is one of the things that brings Muslims, and I would argue humanity, together if we really look at it seriously.
Thank you, Dr. Shubal. Professor Hassan Abbas, along with the question that I posed, that why can't Ali be someone who brings Muslims closer to each other, please also reflect on some concluding remarks for us today.
I'm so grateful again. I have no words to express my gratitude at all this. First and foremost, a quick point which I need to learn more from Professor Shubal on. In fact, actually, I'll say that Rumi, I'm not sure was a Sunni or Shia, which will contradict my own research and my own ideas. But I remember going to Konya and I took a video of that. I was pleasantly surprised that on the tomb of Rumi, all the names of the Shia Imams are mentioned. And I asked many people there, and they said, well, you have observed it. This is well known. This has always been the case. And then there are verses of Rumi, which some of those were taken out from his divan, but also would give you an indication of his, if neutrality is not the right word, but his critique of why Ali's right was not given. So that's an area of further research. I will be very happy think of Rumi as a Sunni, because that he acts as a bridge, bringing everyone together, whatever we call him. But also I am still, that's an area of research to me, which I want to look at further areas, because it seems to me he was a very, at least very neutral, if not leaning towards Shiism, but that becomes irrelevant. And my next point is linked to that. This is just a, I can say humbly, a food for thought for my, especially Muslims, which I have not directly mentioned in the book, but I came so close to it because it's a provocative thought, which I'm about to mention. But nonetheless, I think I owe it to the listeners now and those who will watch this recording, thanks to Brother Mustafa Abdi, whose amazing contributions in the service of Muslim community in America have to be recognized. This statement in Quran al-Hakim, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. The word with firqa and sect. I often think it is so categorical and clear that anyone who, after reading this verse and thinking about it, emphasizes about their own sect is in direct violation of God's command. It's very clear, which means follow this, hold this tight of rope of God tightly and don't get into discord. But the word tafaraka, can anyone tell me if the word Sunni, Shia, these are political words, these are identities, or these are sects? I'll not go further into it, but anyone, if it is seen that all these titles are sects, then there's a direct violation of God's command. I'll leave it at that. I'm thinking about it. I want to know more about it. Yes, if I'll say I follow Ibn Hanbal, Shafi'i, Maliki, Jafar Sadiq, schools of thought, absolutely legitimate. I'm even no one to say the sects are not legitimate, but I'm saying the word sects and the way those identities have been imposed on us maybe are part of the problem. They are not part of the solution. Also on Ali, as a final thought, if we just look at Ali, and that was one of the purposes beyond the Sunni lens and the Shia lens, you'll find that, as Professor Shubal also has rightly mentioned, that the great majority of Muslims are in love with Ali. Because I would not have put it like that. I was reluctant to put it like that, but he's so right. We have not heard the word madad associated or seeking help with the name of any person, any companion. All the companions should be respected. They all had their contributions. They were human beings. And what is often forgotten is, this is more for my Sunni audience, the first three caliphs and some of the very important personalities have to be respected from the core of our heart, from everyone's. But they were human beings. There were jealousies involved. There was politics involved. Mistakes were committed. Those personalities were not personification of the word Islam. We have only when we step a little back from our own rigid worldviews. This goes both for Shia and Sunni. We'll not be able to talk to the other and come to these common ideals. I'll mention this statement which I found with the Prophet's the final moment when if there was ever a last sermon, it was this. When he was offered that we'll bring pen and paper, the Prophet exactly said, No, not after what you have said. Rather, keep well my memory through kindness to the people of my household. Treat with kindness the people of Dhimma, that is, Jews and Christians, and feed the poor. Observe regular prayers and be kind to the women. I often think, is it a biased uh, history of Islam, always written by men mostly, that all the references to women and all the references to minorities somehow get ignored? Two things on which I'll close. One is the famous, there's no other way to pay tribute to Ali, but the famous by Amir Khusro, Shah-e Mardan, Sher-e Yazdan, Quwwat-e Parvardigar, La Fatah illa Ali, La Saif illa Zulfikar, King of the brave, Lion of God, Strength of God. There's no brave young man like Ali. There's no sword like Zulfikar. And last but not the least, and these are the last three sentences from the book. And so, even when the sword struck him, to Ali, on the final day, in his final moments, his last words rang truer than anything else. The line of God's last roar was as gentle as it was honest. By the Lord of the Kaaba, I have triumphed. Thank you very much.
Jazakallah, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for your contributions, your thoughts, your words of wisdom. It's inevitable that when we talk about Imam Ali alayhi salam, the name Rumi comes up invariably. And in this conversation today, we also had the name of Rumi come up several times. I find it so paradoxical that Rumi happens to be, if not one of the most widely read poets in the US today. And yet Rumi takes his inspiration from Imam Ali alayhi salam. I find this paradoxical that more people know Rumi in the United States or in the Western world than they know Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And maybe we hope and pray that the book, The Prophet's Heir, The Life of Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam by Yale University, authored by Dr. Hassan Abbas, with its rich illustrations, timelines, an extensive bibliography, which is a refreshing and a relevant repertoire, worthy of broad-based leadership. And from the academic to the lay reader, Muslim, non-Muslim, it may well serve as a definitive primer in Islamic history for schools and colleges too. And hopefully, as we just discussed, that it will also enhance that empathetic understanding, particularly when humanity is at the crossroads. And we have what President Obama once called the biggest deficit that we have today is the empathy deficit. So this empathy deficit disorder can be redressed by works of this nature which are balanced. And the question that you just answered, that if Ali can help Muslims come closer to God, why can't he be also someone who brings Muslims closer to each other? And that indeed is our prayer today, that we bring about this empathetic understanding that not just Muslims to come together, but the entire humanity coming together on this empathetic understanding of the goodness and the values that were promulgated by Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. And this book is certainly a great addition to those thoughts and teachings. Suffice it to say that I would like to thank our esteemed panelists. Thank you, Dr. Warren Shubal. Thank you, Father Cloyce. Thank you, Dr. Hassan Abbas, and also Mustafa Abdi, who, as Hassan Bhai mentioned, his services and his facilitation, his encouragement, and his vision, so that we are able to partake of these events is commendable for the work that he does. I'd like to thank Ummah as an organization also having facilitated this. By the way, just as a matter of information, there is a simultaneous conference going on by Ummah, which is a conference again on Imam Ali with some spectacular speakers and presenters. Feel free to join. This has been simulcasted on this very channel also. So once we finish here, we invite all our viewers and everyone to join the conference at this point in time. So with that said, I will wish you with the Islamic greeting of Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon everyone who's participated and who have tuned in. Thank you very much.